AM 1460 WXBR, Peter Czymbor still here with you on this Friday morning. You're listening to PM in the AM, the Metro South Morning Show. Peter Czymbor and Mike Pava. Joining us now via the telephone is a Brockton native who has carved out a rather unique niche for himself, or maybe it's been carved out for him, of overseeing compensation funds for victims of just horrendous events. 9/11, the Newtown, Connecticut shootings, the shooting at the movie theater in Colorado last summer, and the Boston Marathon bombings. It's Ken Feinberg. Ken, thank you so much for joining me here on the program this morning.
Glad to be here.
We should also mention that you are going to be in town this Sunday at Temple Beth Amuna in Brockton. There's an event posthumously honoring Dewey David Stone, a Brockton native who had a large impact on the founding of the State of Israel. We'll chat with you a little bit more about that later on in the interview, but first off, we have to talk about this. Tell us exactly what your niche has been in regards to overseeing compensation funds for victims of just horrendous events, and how did this come to be?
Every once in a while, there is a tragedy that so galvanizes the American people that special funds are created to compensate victims. In 9/11, it was a congressional statute passed within 2 weeks after 9/11 that authorized payment of public taxpayer money for the victims of 9/11. After the BP oil spill in the Gulf, BP itself posted $20 billion to pay the victims of the oil spill. And after Aurora, Colorado movie shootings, Virginia Tech, Newtown, the Indiana State Fair windstorm, and now the Boston Marathon bombings, private donors simply contribute their own money to private funds, charitable funds, to be distributed to the victims of these horrific attacks. I never studied for this, I must say. It all began for me back in 1984 when the federal judge overseeing the Vietnam Veterans Agent Orange litigation asked me to come in and try and resolve that case and then design and administer a compensation fund for the Vietnam veterans who were exposed to the Agent Orange herbicide in Vietnam, and that's how it all began.
So now you're kind of the go-to guy when something horrible happens. There's a compensation fund set up for victims of this horrible incident that's happened. You're the go-to guy. I'm sure that is somewhat of a blessing and a curse. It really is a double-edged sword because you get to help out people that need to be helped. At the same time, you are subject to hearing of some horrific stories, and I'm sure that in some cases, whatever it is that you decide they should get, they're never going to be satisfied with.
Well, it's not a blessing at all.
I'll take that back then.
An obligation, but it's an obligation that I think thousands of people, hundreds of Brocktonians, or those living in the Brockton area, if they were asked by Mayor Menino or Governor Patrick to do what they've asked me to do, they would do it as well. It's not rocket science. And yes, you better, whenever you do one of these funds, you better brace yourself, because understandably, you will hear from very angry, frustrated, disappointed, emotional people who are the innocent victims of a horrific tragedy. And no matter how much money you provide them, A, it's not enough, and B, it is no substitute for the death of a loved one.
Now, thus far, over $30 million have been reportedly collected by the One Fund Boston for victims of the Boston Marathon bombings. There was some reports you guys were going to have some town meetings set up and whatnot for victims and victim family members. How is the process going as of right now, and how will it be going moving forward in regards to distributing these funds?
It's right on track. We held last week 2 town hall meetings at the Boston Public Library, where we heard from victims, their families, the public, friends. We explained some ideas for distributing the money. As of Wednesday, the day before yesterday, all claim forms are available to be distributed to the victims who are eligible. We're getting those claim forms out. People will have 1 month until June 15th to return the claim forms, and then on June 30, the $30 million will be distributed to those claimants who are eligible under a final protocol that was released to the public and the families on Wednesday, day before yesterday.
You must have quite a bit of resolve to be the one who has to take the heat for making decisions on who to give what and how.
Well, I have the resolve, but you'd have the resolve, and I think growing up in Brockton, I know that there are plenty of people in Brockton and the surrounding community that would have the resolve. Look, if the President of the United States or the Governor of Massachusetts or the Mayor of Boston asks you to perform a public service on behalf of victims in the nation, I mean, you try saying no to a governor or a president or a mayor. I mean, you don't do it. We all grew up understanding what public service is all about. I was a teenager when President Kennedy was president, and his call to public service. This is a public obligation that I assume, a public obligation, and I believe that there are, I'd like to believe that there are thousands, maybe millions of Americans that would do the same thing. But it is difficult. It's very emotional, and as I say, you better brace yourself for the storm of criticism that is directed at you as the face of the program.
You have to have tough skin just to not let the criticism get to you because, like you said, it's an obligation. You're doing the best you can with what you have to work with, which thankfully in this case is over $30 million according to reports.
That's correct, but now remember, the $30 million is nowhere near adequate. I mean, you're talking here about 4 deaths, maybe 20 single or double amputees, still 20 or 24 people still remaining in the hospital from the bombings. No. $30 million may sound like a lot, but when you think about the horrific injuries here, as well as the deaths, it becomes pretty realistic. You quickly recognize $30 million is not adequate, and claimants, I constantly tell them they better lower their expectations in terms of what they might expect to receive.
Once again, we're chatting with Kenneth Feinberg here on AM 1460 WXBR. He's in charge of One Fund Boston, overseeing compensation funds for victims of the Boston Marathon. Could you explain that a little bit further, claimants lowering their expectations?
If a claimant who suffered a double amputation went to court, a claimant might receive, if the jury so found in his or her favor, over a lifetime, a work life, maybe $10, $15 million. That's one claim. Here we have $30 million to distribute to about 250 people. And when you look at the 250 claims, and you see that there are 4 deaths and about 20 double or single amputations, I just, at the town hall meetings and when I talk with individual family members, I say to them, money is a very poor substitute for your injury or your loss. It can't possibly give you full satisfaction. Don't even think about it. We will demonstrate as best we can through this compensation the community's desire to help. It's symbolic. And we'll give you this money without any obligation on your part. You don't have to promise not to sue. You don't have to promise to spend the money in a certain way. That's entirely up to you, what you do with the money. But here it is. That's all there is. And it's up to you what you want to do with the money.
Once again, we're chatting with Kenneth Feinberg here on AM 1460 WXBR. I think these facts that we were all aware of that you're bringing to light here this morning kind of give people perhaps a little bit more ambition to next time they go to CVS and the cashier says, would you like to donate $1 to the One Boston Fund? The first few weeks after the Boston Marathon bombing, everybody was saying yes, yes, yes. I think it's been waning a little bit, but hopefully with you getting the message out this morning, people will be more inclined to contribute as it seems like there's much, much, much more, and there's really no amount that will ever be reached that will totally appease everyone.
I think that's right. I remember during the 9/11 fund, I met with a woman who had lost her husband. And I said to her, you're going to receive from the 9/11 fund about $3 million tax-free. And she looked at me and she said, you can keep the $3 million. Bring my husband back. And of course, I couldn't do it. I said I couldn't do it. And but that's the problem and the emotion you confront
And you have to be the one who is stoic and realistic in a situation where that claimant obviously was not. There's nothing you can possibly do. You're not God. You're Kenneth Feinberg. You can't bring her husband back. There's nothing you can do to that. How do you even respond? You just kind of, keep a stoic look to you and
you empathize. You express the sentiment. I wish I had that power. I don't. All I can do, Mrs. Jones, and it isn't much, is give you a check. It's a pretty poor substitute for death. And it's all I can do. And you try and convince people to at least accept the money and move on as best they can.
We talked about how that there are town hall meetings set up for you to meet with victims of the Boston Marathon bombings and their family members. How often do you meet face-to-face with victims and victims' family members? And how does that usually go about? Is it always a town hall setting? Do they come to you? Do you go to them if they're in a hospital setting or whatnot? How does that work?
All of the above. First, we hold 2 town hall meetings that are open to the public. It's not confidential. And then, in the Boston Marathon situation, as in 9/11 and other of these programs, there's a window about 10 days in June in Boston when I will meet privately with any family that wants to meet with me or any individual victim. To discuss anything they want to say in private. And then if they're hospitalized, if they can't come to me in Boston at some location, I'll go to them for this private meeting. I'll go to visit them in the hospital. I'll go to visit them at their home. I'll do what I can to accommodate their desire to meet with me. Some want to meet. You'd be surprised, though. Many, many families have no reason to meet with me. They don't want to meet with me. They grieve in private. They see no reason to meet with me, and they just simply file a claim and await their check, which is fine, whatever they want to do.
We're chatting with Kenneth Feinberg here on this Friday morning on AM 1460 WXBR. He's in charge of overseeing compensation funds for victims of the Boston Marathon. You held the same role with different tragedies such as 9/11, Newtown, Connecticut, the Colorado shootings in the movie theater last summer. This Boston Marathon tragedy, a little bit different on 2 fronts. Number one, you are a Brockton native, clearly 25 miles south of Boston. This must have hit home from a geographical standpoint from you because you spent a lot of time in Boston growing up, I'm sure.
Oh, that's correct. I grew up in Brockton on the west side. I went to Brockton High School, went to the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, and I know Boston well, and I know exactly where on Boylston Street this happened. And you can't help but be impacted by it. You don't let it impact your professional objectivity, I must say, in doing what the mayor and the governor have asked you to do. But sure, your heart beats a little faster dealing with fellow Massachusetts residents.
You mentioned earlier in the interview that post 9/11, when you were in charge of setting up the compensation fund or being in charge of the compensation fund for 9/11 victims, that was a government fund, whereas this is more private funds coming from the public at large who is just giving money because they want to. How different is that from a government thing as opposed to private donations?
Oh, it's night and day. The 9/11 fund, I paid out over a 33-month period about $7.1 billion to 5,300 people. That fund, all taxpayer money, will never be replicated. It was a precedent for nothing. It was a one-off standing compensation program. You'll never see that again. The private programs, Newtown, Boston, Aurora, Colorado, Virginia Tech, that's all private money. I am amazed at the charitable impulse of the American people in times of tragedy. They just sent over 50,000 donors sent money in to Boston. And that's all private money. It's given without any condition whatsoever. It is also tax-free, by the way. And the money can be used by the claimants, eligible people, however they want to use it.
And we should mention that you took this obligation asked upon you by Boston Mayor Thomas Menino and Governor Deval Patrick pro bono, so all of the money that folks are donating will go to the victims, correct?
That's correct.
Once again, we're chatting with Kenneth Feinberg here on AM 1460 WXBR, a Brockton native who is overseeing the compensation funds for victims of the Boston Marathon bombing tragedy, One Fund Boston. Kenneth, is there any particular circumstances in your years of being the guy who had the obligation to distribute funds to victims and family members of victims for a number of horrific tragedies that stand out? Any particular claimants or incidents within people trying to get the money?
There are. You could write a book on the number of stories I heard from claimants. Just one example, a woman came to see me after 9/11 sobbing that she had lost her husband, a fireman at the World Trade Center. And she said to me, Mr. Feinberg, I'm 24. My husband left me with our 2 kids, 6 and 4. And you're going to give me $2 million. I need it within 30 days. And I said to her, well, why do you need it so quickly? We have to go through regulations. And she said, I need it within 30 days. I have terminal cancer. I have 10 weeks to live. My husband was going to survive me and take care of our children, and now he's dead. And my children will be orphans, and I need this money while I still have my ability to set up a fund. Well, we accelerated the money, and 9 weeks later, we went to her funeral. You can't imagine the pathos and the tragedy and the horror of some of these individual claims when you hear these stories that underlie the whole compensation program.
When you look back at different decisions you've had to make over the years in regards to distributing funds to victims and family members of victims for these horrible events, is there ever anything you look back at in retrospect and say, I wish I did that differently? Or is it a matter?
All the time.
It is, all the time.
I don't do any of these programs where I don't make mistakes. I remember one time in 9/11, I told a grieving father came to see me. He had lost his son at the Pentagon. And he said to me, Mr. Feinberg, I lost my son. And he was sobbing at his hearing. And I said to him, Mr. Jones, I know how you feel. Well, he looked at me and said, Mr. Feinberg, you have a very difficult job. Not easy. I have some advice. Don't ever tell a father or anybody who lost a loved one that you know how they feel. You have no idea how I feel. And it's a word of advice. Well, it's mistakes like that that I make that you hope you don't make them more than once. And in this work that I do, invariably I'll make mistakes because I'm human and you're dealing with people who are very, very emotional.
Once again, we're chatting with Kenneth Feinberg here on AM 1460 WXBR. Prior to you having this peculiar niche of being the guy who oversees compensation funds for victims of horrific events, where did you see your career going?
I was a lawyer. I had graduated from UMass and then NYU Law School in New York, and I was working in Washington. I had been chief of staff to Senator Ted Kennedy for a while, a glorious assignment. And I was just practicing law in Washington, and little did I realize that I would begin, starting with Agent Orange and Vietnam veterans, that I would begin this specialty in which every time I do it, I hope and pray I won't do it again. And but that's not the way life works, I guess.
I recall Ted Kennedy having a few kind words for you at a ceremony probably held about 10 years ago at this point, seems like just yesterday, where they named this street outside of Campanelli Stadium One Feinberg Way after you.
That was quite a day. The key to the city that day, Dr. Robert Hagelin, an old friend from Brockton, had arranged this with the mayor and the city council, and they named a street after me. We held a ceremony with Senator Kennedy, and Hillary Clinton was also there, and came to Brockton, and it was one day I'll never forget.
Correct me if I'm wrong, you live in Maryland now, right?
I live in Bethesda, Maryland, right outside Washington.
How often do you get back into the Brockton area, and do you still have a lot of friends and family who reside in this region?
Family, no. I'm in Brockton frequently. First of all, I'm chairman of the board of the JFK Library in Boston. So that brings me to Massachusetts and to the Boston area monthly. I don't get to Brockton as much as I did when my folks lived on Highland Terrace on the west side, but I still have high school friends in Brockton. Barry Koritz, for example, a very noted architect in Massachusetts, has his offices still in Brockton. And Dr. Haglin, dentist in Brockton. So I still make appearances in Brockton periodically. And, of course, when they named the street after me, that was a great day. I went to Brockton High School, class of 63. So I went up to the high school that day and spent some time up at the high school. So I get to Brockton periodically.
Brockton High class of 63. I'm Brockton class of 05. So there's some time in between
You're
us.
a youngster.
Yes, I am. But, same school. We got a kinship here, Kenneth. Well, Kenneth, I want to thank you for taking the time out with us this morning to chat with us here on AM 1460 WXBR in regards to the One Boston Fund, where you're overseeing the compensation for victims and family members of that horrible tragedy. Thank you for taking the time out to speak with us this morning. Where do you find the time to do things like this? And this Sunday you'll be appearing at Temple Beth Amuna here in Brockton, where the Brockton Historical Society will be honoring Dewey David Stone, a Brockton native who was instrumental in the founding of the State of Israel. Where do you find the time to do these little projects in between what seems like a gargantuan amount of work and very difficult work?
Well, you make time. You try and find ways. You don't sleep very much, I'll tell you that. So you try and find time. You work weekends. You manage to sort of cabinize your work in a way that can get it done. I must say, Sunday is a labor of love. Not many Brocktonians today may remember the name Dewey Stone. But thanks to Larry Ziskin, a lawyer in Brockton, and the Brockton Historical Society, I am honored to appear at Temple Beth Amuna to honor a Brocktonian who was instrumental, critical, in the creation of the State of Israel back in 1948 and was treasurer of his high school class at Brockton High and became a very noted, nationally known philanthropist. And a Brocktonian his entire life, and a great, great American. And when Larry called and said, do you think you can find time to help celebrate the life of Dewey Stone? I jumped at the chance. He was a great American, and too many Brocktonians aren't aware of Dewey Stone. And I think we'll have a great opportunity on Sunday afternoon to explain why he was such a great American.
It's thanks to guys like Larry Siskind, who is the head of the Brockton Historical Society, that gets the word out there that there is more to Brockton's historical legacy than just Rocky Marciano and Marvelous Marvin Hagler. As great as they may be, it goes far deeper than that.
There are a score or more Brocktonians in our history. Governors, distinguished philanthropists, businessmen, that Brocktonians can point with pride. Dewey Stone is one, and I'll be glad to be part of that ceremony on Sunday afternoon.
Once again, we've been chatting with Kenneth Feinberg here on AM 1460 WXBR, in charge of overseeing the One Boston Fund compensation for victims of the Boston Marathon bombings. Kenneth, before I let you go this morning, is there any final words for our listeners that you'd like to let them know in regards to A, the One Boston Fund, and B, this ceremony you'll be taking part in this Sunday honoring Dewey Stone at Temple Beth Amuna in Brockton?
We've covered both. The One Fund Boston, right on the website. You can go and read all about it and what we're hoping to do. And Brocktonians, if you want to participate in a few hours focused on a great Brocktonian that helped mold our city, come Sunday afternoon at 2 o'clock to Beth Amuna Temple up on Pearl Street and participate in this symposium on what Dewey Stone meant to our local city and the country.
Temple Beth Amuna, corner of Pearl and Torrey in Brockton. Kenneth, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
You're listening to AM 1460 WXBR. We'll step aside for a quick breather. Back with more of the program after this.